Internment camps. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Within weeks, fear swept the West Coast. Military commanders warned of sabotage. Newspapers printed rumors of fifth columns and hidden radio transmitters. None of it was true, but in Washington, the pressure to act was mounting. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Over the next several months, more than 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them U.S. citizens, were forced from their homes. They were given days to sell their property, close their businesses, and report to assembly centers. Entire families lived behind barbed wire, under guard, for years. Inside the government, some officials raised objections. The FBI told the White House it had already identified and detained actual suspects. The Justice Department expressed doubts about the legal justification. Roosevelt moved forward anyway. In 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the policy in Korematsu v. United States. Decades later, that decision was formally repudiated. In 1988, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, issuing an official apology and compensation to survivors. The camps weren't born from necessity. They were born from a president's willingness to let fear override constitutional protections. That choice set a precedent. The next time a president faced a distant enemy and conflicting intelligence, similar pressures would push the country deeper into Vietnam. Vietnam escalation. After World War II, the United States stepped into a conflict it didn't fully understand. By the early 1960s, U.S. military advisors were already on the ground in Vietnam. Then, in August 1964, reports came in of North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacking American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. The details were murky. Some attacks likely never happened. President Lyndon Johnson used the incident to push through a congressional resolution giving him broad war powers. In 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder began, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Ground troops followed. By 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. Inside the White House, advisors like George Ball warned the war was unwinnable on these terms. Johnson ignored him. He believed gradual pressure would force North Vietnam to negotiate. It didn't. American casualties climbed. At home, protests spread. Trust in government eroded. The Pentagon Papers later revealed what many suspected: officials knew the war was going badly and said so in private, while maintaining optimism in public. Johnson had trapped himself. Each escalation was meant to avoid admitting the previous one had failed. And in Washington, when leaders start hiding the truth about a war abroad, the damage doesn't stay contained. It spreads into domestic politics, into the presidency itself. Watergate Coverup. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. Nixon won that November in a landslide. He could have distanced himself from the break-in. Instead, he made a different choice. Nixon directed a cover-up. He authorized hush money payments. He ordered his chief of staff to use the CIA to block the FBI's investigation. For more than a year, the strategy worked. Then, in 1973, one of the burglars talked. A Senate committee launched hearings. When investigators learned Nixon had recorded his own Oval Office conversations, they subpoenaed the tapes. Nixon refused. He fired the special prosecutor in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. In July 1974, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled Nixon had to turn over the tapes. One recording captured Nixon approving the plan to obstruct justice. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974. Several top aides went to prison. The cover-up lasted longer than the crime mattered. What started as a containable scandal became a constitutional crisis because a president chose loyalty to himself over transparency. Watergate taught Americans to doubt their leaders. That mistrust would define the next crisis, as a new president faced a hostage situation that would test every assumption about American power. Iran hostage. In 1953, the United States helped orchestrate a coup in Iran, installing Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah. For decades, he governed as a reliable American ally and harsh authoritarian. In 1979, a revolution swept him from power. Ayatollah Khomeini established an Islamic republic hostile to the United States. President Jimmy Carter, who had made human rights central to his foreign policy, faced a dilemma. In October 1979, he allowed the Shah to enter the United States for cancer treatment. It was humanitarian. It was also a provocation. On November 4, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. Carter tried diplomacy. He tried economic pressure. nothing worked. In April 1980, he authorized Operation Eagle Claw, a military rescue mission. 8 helicopters launched from an aircraft carrier. Mechanical failures took out 3 before they reached the staging area. The mission was aborted. During withdrawal, a helicopter collided with a transport plane. 8 American servicemen died in the desert. The hostages remained captive. The failed rescue became a symbol of American weakness. The hostages were finally released on January 20, 1981, minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in. The crisis lasted 444 days. It reinforced a belief in Washington that hesitation invited humiliation. That belief would shape future decisions, including one that would take the country into Iraq. Iraq invasion. After September 11, 2001, the Bush administration focused on preventing the next attack. The logic was simple: terrorists wanted weapons of mass destruction, and rogue states might provide them. Intelligence agencies reported that Saddam Hussein had pursued such weapons in the past. Some officials claimed he still had them. There were allegations of links between Hussein and terrorist networks. Much of the intelligence was thin or later shown to be false. But in the climate of fear, worst-case assumptions became policy. In March 2003, President George W. Bush ordered the invasion. Baghdad fell in weeks. Bush declared major combat operations over in May. Then the hard part began. The administration disbanded the Iraqi army, putting hundreds of thousands of armed men out of work. There was no plan to secure borders or prevent looting. Insurgents organized quickly. Sectarian violence exploded. Years passed. Casualties mounted. The weapons of mass destruction were never found. By the time U.S. forces withdrew in 2011, more than 4,000 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were dead. The invasion destabilized the region and helped create conditions for ISIS. Iraq demonstrated how easy it is for a president to start a war based on flawed intelligence, and how difficult to end one responsibly. The next president would face a similar question in Afghanistan. Afghanistan Surge. In 2008, Barack Obama campaigned on ending Iraq and refocusing on Afghanistan, the war of necessity. By the time he took office, the Taliban were resurgent. In 2009, General Stanley McChrystal requested 40,000 more troops for counterinsurgency, protecting the population and building Afghan institutions. Inside the White House, debate was intense. Vice President Biden argued for a smaller footprint focused on counterterrorism, drones and special forces, not nation building. Obama spent months reviewing options. He was skeptical more troops would fundamentally change the war's trajectory. But he was unwilling to be the president who lost Afghanistan. In December 2009, he announced he would send 30,000 additional troops, with a timeline to begin withdrawing in 18 months. The surge produced short-term security gains. But the Taliban adapted and waited. Afghan forces remained dependent on American support. The timeline sent mixed messages to allies and enemies. By the time the surge ended, the war had cost more than 2,000 American lives and continued with no clear end. The experience reinforced Obama's preference for more remote tools of power. One had already become central to his strategy: drones. Panama Invasion. In December 1989, President George H.W. Bush ordered the U.S. military to invade Panama. The target was Manuel Noriega, a former CIA asset turned international embarrassment. Noriega trafficked drugs, laundered money, and rigged elections. When a U.S. Marine was killed at a checkpoint, Bush ordered Operation Just Cause. More than 27,000 American troops deployed. The operation was over in days. Noriega surrendered and was brought to the United States for trial. The speed looked like a clean victory. But several hundred Panamanian civilians died. The United Nations condemned the invasion as a violation of sovereignty. Still, the U.S. public largely supported it. For the Bush administration, Panama demonstrated that American military power could achieve clear objectives quickly in a small country. It suggested well-planned interventions could be decisive and relatively cheap. Decades earlier, another assumption about American military superiority had driven policy: the belief that the Soviet Union was pulling ahead in the nuclear arms race, a belief that turned out to be false. Missile gap. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. Americans looked up and saw a new threat. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could deliver a nuclear warhead anywhere. Politicians warned of a missile gap, a dangerous shortfall in America's nuclear arsenal. During the 1960 campaign, John F. Kennedy accused the Eisenhower administration of allowing the United States to fall behind. It was effective politics. It was also misleading. President Eisenhower knew the truth from secret U-2 reconnaissance missions: there was no missile gap. The United States was ahead. But he couldn't reveal the U-2 program publicly. The myth persisted. Kennedy won the election. Once in office, he was briefed on the actual numbers. The gap didn't exist. But political pressure to expand nuclear forces was overwhelming. Kennedy increased production anyway. The Soviet Union, seeing the American buildup, expanded in response. The arms race accelerated. Both sides developed hair-trigger alert systems. Costs soared. The risk of accidental war increased. All of it built on a premise that wasn't true. The missile gap showed how a false narrative, driven by secrecy and politics, could lock presidents into dangerous decisions. It wasn't the only case where secrecy empowered dangerous institutions. For decades, presidents chose loyalty to one unelected official over accountability. Hoover Loyalty. In 1924, J. Edgar Hoover was appointed director of the Bureau of Investigation, later renamed the FBI. He was 29 years old. He would hold the position for 48 years, until his death in 1972. Hoover built the FBI into a professional law enforcement agency. He also built it into a surveillance machine with almost no oversight. Presidents knew this. They kept him in power anyway. Roosevelt used Hoover to investigate political opponents. Truman launched loyalty programs giving the FBI sweeping authority. Eisenhower privately called Hoover a problem but never moved against him. Kennedy and Johnson both feared what Hoover might have in his files. Under Hoover, the FBI ran COINTELPRO, counterintelligence operations targeting civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and political dissidents. Martin Luther King Jr. was surveilled and harassed. Much of this was illegal. Almost none was known publicly until after Hoover's death. In the 1970s, the Church Committee exposed the scope of Hoover's power. Hoover had operated with minimal accountability for decades because presidents found him more useful than dangerous. They chose loyalty over reform. The same culture that tolerated Hoover's authority also deferred to the CIA. And in 1961, a newly elected president learned that deference to intelligence agencies could lead to catastrophic failure. Bay approval. When John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961, he inherited a CIA plan to overthrow Fidel Castro using Cuban exiles trained in Guatemala. The CIA assured Kennedy the operation could work, the exiles would land, spark a popular uprising, and the U.S. role could remain hidden. Kennedy was skeptical but authorized the operation with limits. No U.S. air support once the invasion began. The CIA believed Kennedy would have no choice but to intervene once the exiles were ashore. On April 17, 1961, about 1,400 exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. Castro's forces were waiting. The expected uprising never materialized. The CIA requested air support. Kennedy refused. Within 3 days, the invasion collapsed. More than 100 exiles were killed. The rest were captured. Kennedy took public responsibility. Privately, he was furious at the CIA's overconfidence and his own inexperience. The disaster strengthened Castro and pushed Cuba deeper into the Soviet orbit. After the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy became more cautious about military advice. But the lesson other presidents drew was different. They wanted tools that promised results without public spectacles, methods that could strike enemies quietly, from a distance. Drone expansion. After September 11, the Bush administration began using unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, to target terrorist leaders in places where conventional military operations were too risky or politically difficult. The strikes were rare at first. When Barack Obama took office, he inherited the program and expanded it dramatically. Drones offered an appealing solution. They could strike targets in remote regions of Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia without putting American troops in harm's way. They could be launched from bases thousands of miles away and operated by pilots sitting in air-conditioned rooms in Nevada. The administration argued that the program was legal under the authorization to use military force passed after September 11. They said the strikes were precise and carefully vetted. Between 2009 and 2016, the U.S. conducted hundreds of drone strikes. High-value targets were killed. So were civilians. Exact numbers remain disputed because the program was largely classified. Entire families died in strikes aimed at individual suspects. Weddings and funerals were hit. In 2011, a drone strike killed Anwar al-Awlaki, a U.S. citizen and alleged terrorist recruiter, without trial. 2 weeks later, another strike killed his 16-year-old son, also an American citizen. The administration's legal justification was kept secret for years. Obama later acknowledged the program's moral weight. He said every strike was personally reviewed. But critics argued that making war easier for a president made it too easy to wage. The strikes generated resentment and fueled anti-American sentiment in the regions where they occurred. The precedent was set. Future presidents would inherit an apparatus that allowed them to kill anywhere on Earth with minimal oversight. It was the same logic that had driven intervention in Libya, the promise of a limited, low-cost operation that wouldn't require nation-building or long-term commitment. Katrina Response. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the Gulf Coast as a Category 3 storm. New Orleans had been warned. Forecasters knew the city was vulnerable. Its levees were old. Much of the city sat below sea level. As the storm passed, the levees failed. Water poured into New Orleans. Entire neighborhoods were submerged. Tens of thousands of people were trapped in homes, on rooftops, and in emergency shelters like the Superdome. They waited for help. The federal response was slow and chaotic. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, which was supposed to coordinate disaster relief, seemed overwhelmed. Communication between local, state, and federal officials broke down. Supplies didn't arrive. Evacuation stalled. President George W. Bush was briefed on the severity of the storm before it hit. But images of him looking out the window of Air Force One at the damage below became a symbol of detachment. His FEMA director, Michael Brown, had no significant emergency management experience before being appointed. On September 2, Bush told Brown, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job." By then, bodies were floating in the streets of New Orleans. Later investigations revealed systemic failures at every level. Levees that should have been reinforced years earlier weren't. Emergency plans existed on paper but collapsed under pressure. The federal government had the resources to respond faster. It didn't. More than 1,800 people died. Hundreds of thousands were displaced. Recovery took years and, for some neighborhoods, never really happened. Katrina showed that whether the crisis is at home or abroad, the federal government often underestimates what happens after the initial event. If the United States struggled to stabilize one American city, the challenge of stabilizing a foreign country after military intervention would be even greater. Libya Intervention. In early 2011, protests spread across the Arab world. In Libya, demonstrations against Muammar Gaddafi's 42-year rule turned violent. Gaddafi's forces responded with brutal crackdowns. By March, his military was advancing on Benghazi, a rebel stronghold. Gaddafi vowed to hunt down opponents house by house. The language suggested a massacre. France and Britain pushed for intervention. President Obama was reluctant. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were still unresolved. But the humanitarian argument was strong, and regional allies supported action. On March 17, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution authorizing member states to protect civilians in Libya. 2 days later, NATO began an air campaign. The mission was framed as limited: enforce a no-fly zone, prevent atrocities, give Libyans a chance to determine their own future. But the bombing quickly expanded beyond protecting Benghazi. NATO aircraft targeted Gaddafi's forces across the country. In October, Gaddafi was captured and killed by rebel fighters. Libya's government collapsed. There was no plan for what came next. The country fractured into militia-controlled zones. Two rival governments claimed legitimacy. Extremist groups moved into the vacuum. Weapons from Gaddafi's arsenals spread across the Sahel, fueling conflicts in Mali and beyond. Migrant smuggling networks exploded. Libya became a source of instability across the Mediterranean and North Africa. Years later, Obama called the lack of post-war planning his worst mistake. He said the intervention was the right decision but that the US and its allies failed to think seriously about stabilization. Once again, a president had focused on how to start an operation and underestimated the cost of not planning the aftermath. The pattern reached back decades, to a war that was supposed to stay limited and secret. Cambodia Bombing. By 1969, the Vietnam War had been raging for years with no clear path to victory. North Vietnamese forces used sanctuaries in neutral Cambodia to rest, resupply, and plan attacks. President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, saw an opportunity. If they could destroy those sanctuaries, they believed, they could shorten the war. In March 1969, Nixon authorized Operation Menu, a secret bombing campaign targeting suspected North Vietnamese positions inside Cambodia. The bombings were kept hidden from Congress and the American public. Reports were falsified to show strikes occurring inside South Vietnam instead. The secrecy was deliberate. Nixon knew that expanding the war into a neutral country would provoke backlash. Over the next 14 months, B-52 bombers flew thousands of sorties, dropping more than 100,000 tons of ordnance on Cambodian territory. The North Vietnamese moved deeper into the countryside. The bombing destabilized Cambodia's government. In 1970, a US-backed coup overthrew Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Civil war followed. The chaos helped fuel the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a radical communist movement. When the Khmer Rouge took power in 1975, they emptied Cambodia's cities and executed perceived enemies. An estimated 1.7 million Cambodians died in the genocide that followed. Nixon's secret war didn't shorten the conflict in Vietnam. It spread the war's destruction into a neighboring country and contributed to one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the 20th century. When the bombings were finally exposed, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, attempting to limit a president's ability to wage war without legislative approval. The law has been tested and ignored many times since. Cambodia showed that when presidents use secrecy as a military strategy, the consequences extend far beyond the original mission. It also showed that ending wars is as difficult as starting them. Withdrawal planning. Wars begin with speeches, strategies, and certainty. They end with confusion, last-minute decisions, and the question of who gets left behind. The United States has learned this lesson repeatedly, but never seems to internalize it. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were supposed to bring peace with honor to Vietnam. American troops withdrew. The South Vietnamese government, which had depended entirely on U.S. support, was left to fight alone. Within 2 years, North Vietnamese forces were closing in on Saigon. On April 29, 1975, helicopters lifted off from the roof of the U.S. Embassy, evacuating Americans and a fraction of the South Vietnamese who had worked with them. Thousands more were abandoned. The images of desperate people clinging to helicopters became a symbol of American failure. Nearly 50 years later, the United States repeated the pattern in Afghanistan. In 2020, the Trump administration negotiated the Doha Agreement with the Taliban, setting a timeline for full withdrawal. President Biden inherited the deal and chose to follow through. In August 2021, as U.S. forces pulled out, the Afghan government collapsed faster than anyone in Washington publicly predicted. The Taliban took Kabul. Afghans who had worked with American forces rushed to the airport. The evacuation was chaotic. Thousands of Afghans who qualified for resettlement were left behind. 13 U.S. service members and more than 170 Afghans were killed in a suicide bombing at the airport gate. Both withdrawals revealed the same failures: overconfidence in allied governments, flawed intelligence about enemy strength, and a failure to plan seriously for the human cost of leaving. Presidents focus on exit timelines and political optics. They don't focus enough on who will be protected and how. From the internment camps of World War II to the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, the decisions presidents make under pressure cast long shadows. The lesson isn't that presidents are uniquely foolish. It's that power, fear, and the pressure to act quickly erode judgment. Accountability comes later, if at all. If you found this valuable, consider subscribing for more documentaries that take the time to examine history carefully. Drop a comment with your thoughts or suggestions for what we should cover next. Thanks for watching.